The man on the floor was dying, not slowly, not in the quiet way people imagine death, a gradual dimming, a peaceful surrender. He was dying the way young men die in training evolutions gone wrong, fast, violent, his body turning against itself in the California heat, while a dozen people stood around him and did exactly the wrong thing. Someone had already grabbed a bucket of ice water. Someone else was on a radio calling for a standard heat casualty response. A third man was loosening the trainee's collar, which would help nothing, and which everyone seemed to feel better doing anyway. The two SEALs escorting Sloan Hayes through the corridor of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado didn't slow their pace. She was their problem. The man on the floor was someone else's. Her wrists were zip-tied behind her back. She stopped walking. Not because she asked permission. Not because she explained herself. She simply stopped, and the momentum of the two larger men on either side of her carried them forward half a step before they realized she wasn't moving anymore. "Keep moving," the one on her left said. Sloan was already looking at the trainee on the floor. His name tape read Mercer. He was 22 years old, at most 6 feet tall, and had probably weighed 210 when he'd started Buds. Right now, he looked like a man whose internal thermostat had stopped working entirely, which was exactly what was happening. "His skin is hot and dry," she said. Her voice was level, conversational almost. "Not sweating. That's not heat exhaustion. That's exertional heat stroke. His core temperature is above 104 and going up. Pouring water on him will cool the skin and close the capillaries. It will not cool his brain." The corpsman kneeling beside Mercer looked up, young, uncertain. "Ice packs," Sloan said. "Axilla groin bilateral carotid. Right now. And get CASVAC on the line, not the standard heat response protocol. Tell them his mental status is altered and you need IV access and active core cooling, not surface cooling." The SEAL on her left put a hand on her arm. "I said keep. He will seize in approximately 4 minutes if you don't change what you're doing." She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. "You can move me after." Something in the corridor went very still. The corpsman looked at the bucket of ice water in someone else's hands, looked back at Sloan, made a decision. "Ice packs," he called out. "Get me ice packs, axilla and groin. And somebody get CASVAC on the line. Tell them altered mental status, suspected exertional heat stroke." The corridor erupted into controlled motion. Sloan watched for 3 seconds, confirmed the corpsman had it, and then started walking again on her own. The two SEALs fell back into position beside her, and none of them said anything for a long moment. The one on her right, she'd heard the other one call him Finch, looked straight ahead. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man who had just watched something he didn't expect and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. She gave him nothing to work with, just walked. Her name was Sloan Merritt Hayes, 27 years old, 5'4", 122 pounds on a good day, which the Navy had documented twice yearly for the past 4 years, with the bureaucratic thoroughness that military organizations applied to things that didn't particularly matter. Brown hair dark enough to read as black in low light, pulled back without ceremony. Eyes the color of a winter sky over the Appalachians gray with something colder underneath. Her service record was clean, exceptional even for a hospital corpsman at her grade. 4 years of documented performance, 2 deployments, 1 to Djibouti, supporting Marine expeditionary operations, 1 to a forward surgical element in eastern Syria that her evaluations described with the careful vagueness the military used when it didn't want to specify exactly what someone had done or where they had done it, and then 8 months in 2019 that weren't there. Not redacted in the standard way where the black ink told you something had existed even if it wouldn't tell you what. Simply absent. A gap in the record where a gap shouldn't be like a page torn cleanly from a book, so that the binding still looked intact until you counted the chapters and found one missing. The DIA flag had come through at 1400 hours. The base security system had processed her common access card without issue at the main gate and again at the secondary checkpoint. It was the tertiary access point, the one that fed into the BUD/S training compound, that had returned the error. Not a standard access denial, something more specific. A credential mismatch that had kicked the record 2 levels above where base security normally operated and landed on a desk at the Defense Intelligence Agency where someone apparently had firm opinions about Sloan Hayes and her missing 8 months. The order that came back was simple: hold for verification. So here she was. The holding room was utilitarian in the way that all military holding rooms were utilitarian. A table, 3 chairs, fluorescent lighting that had been installed sometime in the previous century and never replaced because it still worked and working was sufficient. A wall-mounted camera in the upper left corner. A mirror on the right wall that wasn't fooling anyone. The scar on her right shoulder pulled slightly when she sat down. It always did when she'd been walking quickly or carrying weight. She'd stopped noticing it most days. Today, it was reminding her of things she didn't need to be reminded of. The man who came in first was a lieutenant commander named Breslin. He had the look of an intelligence officer. Not the cinematic version, the real version, which meant he was precise, methodical, and entirely unimpressed by her face, which she'd learned by the age of 19 was unusual enough in this environment to be worth noting. He set a folder on the table, opened it, read from it in a way that made clear he'd already read it several times and was now reading it at her. Hospital Corpsman, Second Class Sloan Hayes, 4 years active service. 2 documented deployments. He paused at the next page. April through December 2019. No record. Sloan said nothing. You were assigned to Fleet Forces Command during that period according to your service jacket. Fleet Forces Command has no record of your assignment. She looked at the table. Miss Hayes, Breslin closed the folder. I'd like to understand what you were doing in Kunar Province, Afghanistan in September of 2019. The room was quiet for a moment that stretched past comfortable and kept going. I'd like to make a phone call, Sloan said. I understand this isn't a civilian arrest. I'm not invoking a civilian right. I'm making a request. She looked at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. Call Rear Admiral Warren Decker. He's at Walter Reed Medical Center. Post-surgical recovery cardiac unit. He'll answer. Breslin studied her. Admiral Decker is recovering from a significant surgical procedure. He's not available for... He'll answer, she said again, simply, without emphasis. And then she went back to looking at the table, and she didn't say anything else. 3 weeks earlier, Sloan Hayes had arrived at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado with orders that were real, a contractor badge, that was real and a reason for being there, that was real, and also the only part of the situation she wasn't discussing with anyone. The assignment was a replacement posting. The corpsman, originally slated for SEAL Team 8's training support rotation, had torn his ACL during a recreational basketball game, the kind of injury the Navy treated with the particular institutional disappointment reserved for people who got hurt doing something other than their job. A replacement had been needed quickly. Sloan's record had come up. Someone had approved the transfer without looking too closely at 2019, which was either administrative carelessness or something more deliberate, and she had made the decision not to examine that question too carefully. She'd reported to Senior Chief Petty Officer Dale Rourke at 0700 on a Tuesday. Rourke was 51 years old and had the physical presence of a man who had decided at some point in his late 30s that maintaining peak condition wasn't vanity, it was professional obligation, and had not deviated from that decision since. His hair had gone gray at the temples in a way that looked less like aging and more like a badge of rank, something earned over decades of hard use. His face gave away approximately nothing. He'd looked at her service jacket for 45 seconds, looked at her, looked back at the jacket. Team's been running with a rotating corpsman for 3 weeks, he said. We don't like rotating corpsmen. We like our corpsmen knowing our history, our injuries, our habits. We like our corpsmen knowing that Petty Officer First Class Renner has a calcium deposit in his left shoulder that shows up on imaging and looks worse than it is, and that Chief Finch has a stress fracture in his right foot that he hasn't reported and will not report, and which I'm pretending not to know about. He set the jacket down. Can you do that job? Yes, Senior Chief. How long does it take you to learn a man's medical history well enough to make a field judgment without asking questions? 1 conversation, she said. Maybe 2 for the complicated ones. Rourke looked at her for another moment. Report to the team at 0730, East Range. He hadn't smiled, he hadn't frowned. He'd simply moved on to the next item on his list, which she would come to understand was his version of a welcome. Chief Petty Officer Garrett Finch had not been equally reserved. He was 42, broad across the shoulders, in the way of a man who had been doing heavy physical work since his teens and hadn't stopped, with a voice that carried the flat vowels of the upper Midwest and a face that expressed skepticism the way other faces express greeting, as a default setting the position from which all other reactions were measured. He'd looked at her when she arrived at the East Range and said, with no particular hostility, but also no attempt at diplomacy, "Doc's a girl half my size, fantastic." The man standing to his left, Petty Officer First Class Nolan Ashby, had not reacted. He simply looked at her once, a quick and thorough assessment that started at her eyes and ended at her hands, and then he stepped slightly to the side so she had room to pass. It was the smallest possible acknowledgement. But Ashby was not a man who made unconscious gestures, and she filed it away without comment. Petty Officer First Class Tad Renner had shaken her hand and said nothing beyond his name, which she would come to understand was his highest form of initial respect. The first 3 days were a sustained act of professional skepticism that Sloan couldn't take personally because it was entirely rational. SEAL teams were closed systems. They operated on trust built over years of shared suffering, shared danger, shared bad decisions, and good ones, and the specific intimacy that came from knowing how a man moved and breathed and made choices when everything was going wrong. A new corpsman was a variable. Variables introduced risk. Risk in their world had a specific and permanent cost. Rourke had reasons beyond the standard ones. The corpsman before the man who'd torn his ACL had been technically skilled, but had hesitated in a live fire training incident 8 months back, 4 seconds, maybe 5, and a SEAL named Torres had needed surgery on his leg that might have been unnecessary if the response had been immediate. Torres was fine now, but Rourke remembered the 4 seconds. Any corpsman who came after would be measured against them. Sloan understood this. She didn't resent it. She noted it and moved forward. The morning of the fourth day was when Owen Mercer hit the ground. It was a heat evolution. Bud/S candidates, the latest class grinding through the early weeks of the most demanding military training program in the world, were running their third 2-mile interval of the morning, with the Pacific pushing heat and humidity off the beach, and the instructors maintaining the particular demeanor of men who had long since made peace with watching other people suffer. Mercer was third from the front when he lost his stride. He didn't fall dramatically. He simply stopped running, stood still for one strange second, and then went down sideways with the boneless quality of a person whose nervous system had stopped negotiating with gravity. The response was immediate and wrong. Someone called for water. Someone else was on the radio running the standard heat casualty protocol. 2 instructors were moving toward Mercer to get him into shade, which was the right instinct applied to the wrong problem. Sloan was 20 feet away, moving before the second man hit his radio. She was kneeling beside Mercer in 4 seconds, her fingers at his neck, her other hand at his wrist, looking at the color of his skin and the set of his jaw and the way his eyelids were moving or not moving. Hot and dry, she said. No perspiration. This isn't heat exhaustion. The instructor with the water looked at her. Exertional heat stroke. His core temp is climbing and it's not going to stop on its own. She looked up. Ice packs, axilla bilateral groin carotid. Don't put the water on him. It will cool the surface and close the cutaneous vasculature and trap the heat inside. I need IV access and CASVAC with active core cooling capability, not surface cooling. She looked directly at the instructor. Are we doing this? Finch was standing 5 feet away. She could feel him watching. Ice packs, the instructor said, because the explanation behind the instruction was sound and because there was something in Sloan's voice that was not urgency. Urgency could be wrong. Urgency could be panic dressed up in speed, but certainty. The specific quality of a person who had seen this exact thing before and knew precisely where it went if you didn't change direction. The ice packs came. Sloan placed them with the economy of motion that came from drilling a skill until it lived below the level of thought. Axilla, bilateral groin, the thick vessels at the neck where blood ran close to the surface and temperature change actually reached the core. She called the CASVAC herself from the instructor's radio with the correct protocol and the correct patient data, because knowing the right number to call and the right words to use when you called it was also part of the job. Mercer's eyes focused. Not fully, not yet, but the vacancy in them receded. She was reaching across him to check his IV access when her right hand passed over the M4, leaning against the wall behind the instructor's station, and her fingers touched the receiver, and the tips of 3 fingers found the safety selector, automatically, without direction, without thought, the way a pianist's hands found keys in the dark. She pulled her hand back. Ashby was standing to her left. He'd moved closer during the response, close enough to help, far enough to stay out of the way, and she did not look at him. But she understood that he was the kind of man who noticed small things, and the selector had moved under her fingers with the ease of something practiced 10,000 times, and the angle of his attention had shifted. She said nothing, filed it away. The afternoon was notable in one way. The team ran a terrain familiarization exercise along the northern perimeter, low-intensity movement, the kind that kept reflexes calibrated between harder evolutions. Sloan moved at the back of the formation and at the northern tree line. When the element paused, her eyes went without intention to the elevated ground to the east. A ridgeline not dramatic, but enough to create a dead angle the formation's current position didn't account for. Her gaze moved to the approach corridor from the southeast, a dry creek bed barely visible that ran at a slightly lower elevation, and would be impossible to observe from the west until someone was already in it. She'd estimated the sight lines and distances without thinking about it, the way you calculated something you'd done 1,000 times, and she was 3 steps into quantifying the tactical vulnerability before she caught herself. Rourke was looking at her. "Old habit," she said. He held her gaze. "What habit is that?" "Watching the ground. Most corpsmen watch the men." "I watch both," she said. He turned back to the formation without commenting further. But she had the distinct sense that what she'd said had gone somewhere interior and organized and carefully kept the way experienced men stored things they intended to understand later. The flag came at 1400. She was in the medical bay updating Renner's file. The calcium deposit in his left shoulder was doing exactly what it always did, creating imaging that looked alarming and actually wasn't when the base security system sent a notification that her AC credentials had been escalated for review. Not denied. Escalated. A different category entirely carrying protocols that indicated the order had come from somewhere significantly above base security. She closed Renner's file, locked the cabinet, set her pen down in a neat line with the edge of the desk. She had known this was possible. She had accepted it as a cost of being here. The 2 SEALs who appeared in the doorway of the medical bay were professional about it. No theatrics. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." "All right," she said, and she went. The holding room with its fluorescent hum felt smaller the longer she sat in it. Breslin had made his phone call and been told something that had rearranged his working assumptions, and he was currently in the corridor outside doing something with that information. She could hear through the wall the distant sound of the BUD/S evolution resuming on the beach instructors' voices, the rhythmic punishment of men choosing difficulty, because what was on the other side of it was worth having. She had listened to that sound through the medical bay window for 4 days, and something in it still reached her in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Her father had described it once. Not the sound specifically, but the quality of it, the way honest hard work had a texture you could sense even from a distance. He'd said it in their kitchen in Fayetteville on a Sunday morning, coffee going cold on the counter, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, where he kept them when he was thinking. She'd been 16. By the time she fully understood what he'd meant, he wasn't there to tell. The door opened. Breslin stood in the frame with the recalibrated attention of a person who had just received data that changed the shape of the problem in front of him. "Describe the scar on your right shoulder," he said. She looked up. 2 inches diagonal. Right shoulder posterior surface, approximately 4 centimeters below the acromion. He was quiet for a moment. "Admiral Decker would like to speak with you," he said. "And after that, there are some things he'd like explained to the people in this building." He paused. "Starting with why he told me to take the restraints off." He left the door open. Sloane sat in the chair in the humming fluorescent room and looked at the open door for a long moment. Then she stood, rolled her right shoulder once against the familiar pull of old scar tissue, and walked through it. The phone was a standard military-issue handset, and it sat on the table in front of her with the weight of something considerably more significant than its 14 ounces. Breslin had set it down and stepped back, not out of the room entirely, but far enough that the conversation would have the shape of privacy without the substance of it. Sloane picked it up. "This is Hayes." The voice on the other end was slower than she remembered. Deliberate in a way that wasn't his natural rhythm. She could hear the effort behind it, the careful management of breath that people used when breathing had recently become a more conscious act. Post-surgical, cardiac. She filed the clinical observations and set them aside. "I'm told," Warren Decker said, "that you walked into a federal installation with outdated credentials and then corrected a heat stroke response while being escorted to detention." "And the credentials weren't falsified," and she said, "and they were outdated. That's a meaningful distinction to you?" "Yes, sir." A pause. She could hear the low machinery hum of a hospital ward, the particular acoustic texture of a room designed for people who needed quiet. "How long have you been at Coronado Dome?" 4 days. 4 days, he repeated, "and you waited until now." "I needed to understand the situation first." "Your father used to say something like that. He'd walk into a room and not say anything for 20 minutes, and then tell you he was getting a read on things." Something in Decker's voice shifted slightly, not amusement exactly, but adjacent to it. "He was usually right." Sloane said nothing. "There's an envelope," she said. "He sent it to you in January of 2021, 2 months before Helmand." The silence that followed was different from the pauses before it, fuller, the kind that had weight and history inside it. "I know about the envelope," Decker said. "I know you know. I've known for 3 years." She kept her voice even. This was not the moment for anything but precision. "I needed you here to act on it, not from a hospital. Here." A long pause. "I'll be there Thursday morning," he said. 7 a.m. "That's 2 days before Strick arrives." "Yes," a measured breath. "That's deliberate." He ended the call. Sloan set the handset down. Breslin was looking at her with the expression of a man who had listened to half a conversation and understood approximately one-third of it. "Admiral Decker is requesting I be released to standard duty pending his arrival Thursday," she said. "He told you to tell me that." "He told me he'd be calling your commanding officer in approximately 4 minutes to say the same thing." She paused. "I thought you might prefer to know first." Breslin picked up his own phone. She was back in the medical bay by 1700. She updated Renner's file, pulled the rest of the team's records, and read them the way she read everything completely, once retaining what mattered. She noted Finch's stress fracture, which was slightly worse than Rourke had implied. She noted Ashby's pattern of tension headaches that had never been formally attributed to a cause, and that she suspected were connected to a cervical alignment issue that years of field work had quietly worsened. She noted these things and did not yet say them to anyone. At 1900, she ate alone and went to her bunk and lay in the dark with her right hand on her sternum and thought about an envelope sealed in January of 2021 by a man who had known with the methodical honesty of someone who had spent 30 years being thorough that he might not be there to open it himself. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did not dream, which had been true for most of her adult life, and which she had decided to count as a form of mercy. Thursday arrived with a marine layer off the Pacific that turned the base gray and soft at the edges, the kind of California morning that looked like a painting of itself. Sloan was in the medical bay at 0630, and Rear Admiral Warren Decker walked through the main gate at 0657. Rourke came to the medical bay at 0710. "You have a visitor." "I know," she said. He looked at her steadily. "He flew in from Walter Reed, post-surgical." "I know." Rourke was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man who didn't ask questions before he was ready for answers. "I'll want a full brief," he said. "You'll get one," she said. He left. She set aside what she was doing and walked to the briefing room. Warren Decker was 64 years old. She had last seen him 6 years ago, horizontal on a hillside in Kunar province, with 2 rounds in him and his lung filling with air from the wrong side, and the version of him standing in this room was different in ways that had nothing to do with the surgical pallor still working its way out of his complexion. He'd been solid then, the kind of solid that came from operating in hard places for 20 years. He was still solid now, but it sat differently on him. The way old timber sat differently from new timber, denser, more deliberate, with the specific gravity of something that had taken a long time to become what it was. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Turn around." She turned. He looked at the scar on her right shoulder, visible above the neckline of her uniform, 2 inches diagonal, the color of old silver against her skin. "Shrapnel," he said, "from the creek bed. Rock fragment. The blast was close." She turned back. "It was already closed by the time I had time to notice it." Decker nodded slowly. He pulled out a chair and sat, and she understood that the surgery had taken more from him than he was acknowledging, and that standing for extended periods was currently costing him something. She did not comment on this. He would not have welcomed it. "Sit," he said. She sat. He looked at her with the expression of a man arranging a very large number of things in a particular order before speaking. "Kunar," he said, "September 2019. Tell me what I didn't see." She had known this conversation was coming, had been composing it in some sense for 6 years. "I was 21, she said. "I was in Kunar province on a legitimate NGO posting a medical support for a clinic in the Korengal Valley Access Corridor. My cover was clean. My reasons for being there were real, but I'd been tracking my father's operational area for 8 months because he was operating out of a forward base 40 kilometers north, and his last 3 check-ins had been shorter than usual. Not wrong, just compressed." She paused. He was worried about something. He didn't say it in the calls, but it was in the compression. Decker listened with the stillness of a man who had been briefed on hard things for 30 years and knew that interruption was rarely efficient. "The night of September 14th, I was at the clinic. We heard contact to the northeast. The pattern of fire was wrong, too organized on one side, too fragmented on the other, which meant a small element had been hit by something that had been waiting for them specifically. I took the kit and went north. I found your position in approximately 40 minutes. "In the dark," Decker said. "My father taught me that terrain. He'd walked me through that corridor on maps since I was 15. Knowing ground before you need it was the first thing he ever taught me about operating in unfamiliar places." Decker was quiet for a moment. "3 of my men were already gone when you arrived." "Yes." She said it plainly without the softening people usually apply to that kind of statement. The plainness was its own form of respect. I couldn't help them. You were bleeding from the femoral branch. The round had clipped it without hitting the main artery, but you were losing faster than you looked, and the chest was the immediate priority. Tension pneumo, he said. Left side, breath sounds were already absent. I had the needle in before I had my kit fully open. She looked at her hands for a moment. I had done the procedure twice before on real patients. My father had made sure of that. Where is he, Sloan? She had been waiting for this to become the next sentence. Helmand Province, March 2021. He was on a joint advisory mission with the 3rd Special Forces Group, walking a route that had been reported as cleared. It wasn't cleared. An IED that shouldn't have been there was there in a corridor that someone had either failed to clear properly or had deliberately listed as cleared when it wasn't. She kept her voice level. This was old pain, and old pain had a different texture, denser, quieter, less sharp, and more total. He died on impact. The room held the information for a moment. The man who signed the route clearance approval, Sloan continued, is Brigadier General Howard Strick. He was the Deputy Operations Officer for the Combined Advisory Mission. He had access to the route intelligence. He had reason to protect a logistics corridor running adjacent to the cleared route, a corridor being used for purposes that were profitable and not sanctioned by a defense contractor named Carlton Breeze. Keeping that corridor active was worth a great deal of money to Breeze. Having the adjacent route officially cleared, trafficked a source of attention was a problem. She paused. My father was the senior advisor who had flagged concerns about the intelligence quality on that route. He'd done it twice in writing. He'd been told both times the assessment was final. Decker had gone very still. He died 2 weeks after his second written objection. Strick signed the final route clearance approval 10 days before the incident. The marine layer outside had begun breaking. Light came through the window in pieces the way it always did on this coast. The envelope, Decker said. He sent it to you because you were the ranking officer he trusted who also had reason to act on it. You'd been in theater. You knew the operational landscape. And you had no financial relationship with Brees or his network, which put you outside everything my father had documented. She looked at him directly. He also knew you were alive because of his daughter. He thought that might matter. Decker was quiet for a long time. It has mattered, he said, every day for 6 years. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set an envelope on the table. Sealed, hand-addressed in the compressed, functional handwriting of a man who had spent 30 years writing field notes in difficult conditions. The return address was an APO number. Above it, the name P. M. Hayes. Sloan looked at it. She had known it existed. She had accounted for it in every calculation she'd made over 4 years. But seeing it was different from knowing it existed more weight, more of the quality of having been held by particular hands. She did not touch it. Thursday, she said. That's 2 days before Strick arrives. I want to understand everything before he lands, Decker said. He looked at her with something that occupied the specific space between assessment and recognition. Your father said you'd know when the time was right. He was usually right about timing. Almost always. Decker put the envelope back in his jacket. What do you need from me before Saturday? Stay visible but removed until Friday night, she said. Let me do what I do. And what do you do? She stood. I make sure the people around me are still alive when it matters. She found Finch in the equipment bay at 1400 running a maintenance check on his kit with the methodical thoroughness she had come to recognize as simply how he operated, not performance, not habit, but professional discipline. So ingrained it had become character. She told him about the stress fracture, not as judgment, as fact with a clinical framing that made clear she was not interested in reporting it but in managing it, taping before operations, adjusting load distribution on the right side, tracking the specific quality of pain that differentiated stable from progressing. Finch listened without looking at her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Rourke told you, he said. Rourke told me it existed. The file told me where. Your gate told me the rest. A pause. You've been watching my gate. I watch everything. That's the job. He looked up from the kit. He had the expression of a man in the process of revising something, doing it with the honesty of someone who had decided long ago that being wrong was preferable to being persistently wrong. The heat stroke call, he said. Tuesday. Yes. The skin was dry. Yes. He nodded once and went back to his kit. She left him and didn't say anything else because knowing when to stop was as important as knowing what to say, and she had learned that from the same person who had taught her everything else that mattered. The clearing operation that night was not supposed to be significant. A routine sweep of the northern access corridor, 2 hours known terrain low threat assessment. Rourke had included Sloan in the element because integrating the corpsman into movement patterns was standard practice, and because something in the way she'd handled the heat stroke response had shifted the team's understanding of what standard practice meant when she was present. She moved at the left flank between Ashby and the tree line, and the November darkness was the particular density of a coastside base, never complete the ambient light from the facility behind them turning everything ahead into gradations of gray. It was Ashby who heard it first. A sound that didn't belong in the northern corridor at a distance and angle that didn't fit the patrol rhythm they'd established. He raised a fist. The element stopped. The element. Sloan had heard it a half-second after him. The muzzle flash came from elevated ground, 60 meters to the northeast, a sharp white point that existed for less than a second before the round went into the dirt 6 feet from Rourke's position. Someone had been waiting in the tree line with enough patience and enough knowledge of their patrol timing to be correctly positioned. That said two things simultaneously. This was not random, and someone had been feeding information about their patterns to people who were using it. The element went to cover as 2 more rounds came in. Sloan assessed the geometry from behind a concrete drainage barrier. The shooter had the high ground by 30 feet, which gave him a clean line over most of their available cover. She looked at Ashby's M24 on his back. He was already taking it off. She accepted it without comment. The distance was 1,150 meters. The angle was steep 15 degrees of upward deflection, which changed the ballistic calculation in ways that required arithmetic rather than estimation. The wind had shifted since the afternoon coming, now from the northwest at somewhere between 8 and 11 knots, with the variability that coastal night air carried. Her right shoulder, where the rock fragment had opened a channel along the posterior deltoid in 2019, was tight from the cold and the movement and the particular stress of prone positioning. She went prone anyway. The shoulder communicated its objection in the language of old damage, not sharp, not incapacitating, the persistent kind that occupied space and awareness without directing action. Her father had told her once that pain was information, not instruction. She had been 14 when he said it. She understood it fully now. She adjusted her body weight to take pressure off the right shoulder, accepting a less stable left side as the cost of the modification. The scope found the elevated position in the tree line, a shape against shapes, the stillness of a person waiting, which was different from the stillness of trees. The wind moved across the back of her neck. She tracked it against the scope reticle, against the sound of it in the upper branches 20 meters to her right, which were moving at a slightly different rate than the branches nearer the target position, a deflection effect in the corridor she was shooting across. She made the adjustment, reset against the shoulder's objection, breathed, one shot. The shape in the tree line stopped being still. Ashby had been counting seconds beside her. He stopped counting. The element moved forward. Rourke confirmed the position, a man who would later be identified as connected to a contractor security network that had been monitoring the base's patrol patterns for 2 weeks. He was alive. He was not going to be able to run. Rourke looked at Sloan when she stood. He recorded what he saw the way competent senior leaders recorded things completely accurately and with a clear understanding of what it meant for subsequent decisions. Finch came around the element's perimeter. He looked at the distance marker on Ashby's range card, looked at the elevation notation, looked at her. She was rolling her right shoulder against the specific complaint the position had lodged, her face expressing nothing in particular. 1150, he said. Yes. Uphill. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, visibly revising a significant number of assumptions with the honesty of a man who had decided that revision was preferable to being wrong indefinitely. Your shoulder, he said. He had noticed the way she'd moved it. Old damage, it managed. Does it need? No. She picked up her kit. Let's get back. They got back. She taped Renner's shoulder in the medical bay at 22:30, working by low light, and Renner sat on the treatment table without saying anything for most of it. When she was almost finished, he said quietly, 1150, uphill, with that shoulder. It was manageable, she said. I know. He watched her complete the tape job. That's exactly the point. Ashby found her in the medical bay when she was finishing the documentation for the night operation. He came in without preamble and sat in the chair beside the desk and looked at the wall for a moment before speaking. I pulled your father's record, he said. She didn't look up. Master Sergeant Paul Merritt Hayes, 5th Special Forces Group, 3 tours, Afghanistan 1 Iraq, KIA Helmand Province, March 2021. He paused. Non-hostile incident. Route clearance failure. Yes, she said. That's what the record says. That's what the record says, she agreed. Ashby was quiet. You've been investigating. 4 years. He absorbed this. Strick. Yes. He signs the clearance approval. 10 days before the incident, after 2 written objections from my father about the quality of the route intelligence. Ashby let this settle. He was a man who didn't speak before the weight of a thing had landed properly, and she had learned over the past week to read his silences the way she read vital signs, each one slightly different, each one telling you something specific about the state of the person producing it. He's coming Saturday, Ashby said. I know. And Decker is coming Friday night. Yes. Ashby looked at her directly. What's in the envelope? She set down what she was doing and looked at him. My father's documentation, financial records, communication logs, the relationship between Strick and a defense contractor named Carlton Brees, the money, the route suppression, all of it. He spent 2 years building it. He sent it to Decker in January because he knew he was being watched and couldn't move through channels. The channels included people who were part of what he was documenting. Ashby was quiet for a long time. He sent it to Decker because of Kunar, he said. Because of Kunar. Because he knew what Decker owed. And because he trusted that a man kept alive by his daughter would not look away from what that daughter needed. Outside the medical bay window, the last of the marine layer had dissolved. The water beyond the perimeter fence was doing what it always did at this hour, dark, constant, indifferent to the specific concerns of the people on its shore. Ashby stood. He moved to the door and stopped without turning around. The safety switch, he said, Tuesday, when you touch the M4. She waited. That was muscle memory, older than your service jacket. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. My father started teaching me when I was 10, she said. He said that a person who knew medicine but couldn't protect their patient was only half useful. He didn't believe in half useful. Ashby nodded once slowly. He left without saying anything else, which was how he expressed that he had understood completely. Saturday arrived without ceremony. The sun came up over the Pacific the same way it always came up. The base moved through its morning rhythms. The Bud/S candidates were already in the water by 0600, and the sound of instructors' voices carried across the compound with the same indifferent authority they carried every morning. Sloane had been awake since 0430, not from restlessness. She had lain there until 0430 because that was when she had decided to get up, and she had spent the preceding 5 hours in complete, uninterrupted sleep because she had trained herself over many years to sleep when sleep was available. Her father had told her that the men who fell apart in hard situations were usually the men who had gone into them already depleted. She dressed in the dark, sat at the small desk in her quarters with coffee she didn't particularly taste, and went through the day one final time, not because it needed refinement, but because going through things a final time was how she confirmed they were finished, the way a surgeon counted instruments before closing. The envelope had been opened the previous evening. Decker had arrived at 1900, and they had sat in the briefing room with Rourke present, and Decker had broken the seal with the deliberateness of a man who understood that some actions were irreversible and wanted to be fully present for the crossing of that line. The contents were what her father had promised. 12 pages assembled with the precision of a special forces medic who had spent 30 years understanding that the difference between documentation that mattered and documentation that didn't was specificity, dates, account numbers, communication, timestamps, the name Carlton Brees appearing 7 times across 4 separate documents, each instance linking him to Strick through financial channels structured to obscure the relationship, and which had succeeded in obscuring it from everyone except a man who had decided to look until he found what he was looking for. Rourke had read it twice without speaking. When he finished the second pass, he set it on the table and looked at the wall for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something he had believed was fixed. Decker had said, I need this in front of the NCIS office chief by 700 Saturday, and I need 2 agents inside that building when Strick arrives. Rourke had said, I'll make the call. He had made the call, and now it was Saturday and the sun was up, and Sloane drank her coffee and confirmed that the plan was complete, and when she was finished, she set the cup down and went to the medical bay because that was where she needed to be. Strick landed at North Island Naval Air Station at 0840. He was traveling with a staff of 4, an aide, a JAG officer, a public affairs coordinator, and a personal security contractor named Douglas Hale, a former Ranger who had separated from service 3 years prior and moved into private work with the particular ease of someone who had been preparing for the transition long before it happened. His name had appeared twice in her father's documentation. Not prominently a peripheral figure, a man at the edges of the structure listed in Breeze's communication logs as a contact for what was described as site security consultation. She had assessed him as secondary, a detail. She had been wrong about the edges. The inspection was scheduled to begin at 1000. A formal walkthrough of training facilities, a brief with Rourke and team leadership, a review of readiness documentation that would, in the ordinary course of events, result in a favorable assessment incorporated into Strick's promotion package. This was not going to be the ordinary course of events. At 0930, Sloan was in the medical bay when she heard voices in the outer quarter. One of them Renner's carrying the specific register of a man engaged in a conversation he hadn't chosen to initiate. She recognized the other voice a moment later as belonging to someone whose credentials she had seen that morning when Strick's detail had checked in at the main building Douglas Hale listed on the manifest as personal security. She was already moving when she heard the impact. Not a fall, not an accident. The specific sound of a compromised woman being driven into a wall at an angle that someone with knowledge of the existing injury had calculated would do maximum damage with minimum visible force. The sound of something deliberate dressed as something incidental. By the time she reached the corridor, Hale was walking away at the unhurried pace of a man who understood that what he had just done would read as an accident to anyone who hadn't been specifically watching for it. Renner was on the floor, his left arm held against his body with the careful stillness of someone managing acute joint trauma, and his color was already shifting in the way that told her the fall had done something more than simple dislocation. She went to him without hesitation. "Stay with me," she said. Her hands were already moving through the assessment. "Talk to me. Pain level." 9, he said through his teeth. "That's honest." Pulse at his wrist weak and accelerating. The pallor was progressing. "Vascular involvement. The joint has gone. I need to reduce it before I can address the circulation. This is going to be worse before it's better." "Already past better," he said. "Hold on." She was in the middle of the reduction when her radio went off. Ashby's voice compressed with the specific quality of a man relaying information at speed while managing his own reaction to it. "Sloan, roof of the Eastern Equipment Building. One individual elevated position, optic confirmed. He has a line on the courtyard. Decker is in the courtyard." She absorbed this. Renner looked at her. He understood exactly what the transmission meant and exactly what it meant that she was currently holding his dislocated shoulder in both hands. "Go," he said. "I finish what I start," she said. She completed the reduction. The joint returned with a particular sensation she had learned to feel for bone finding its socket, the slight release of tension in surrounding musculature. Renner's breath came out hard and controlled. She packed the shoulder with materials from her kit, moving with speed. Speed that was not frantic. Frantic produced errors, and errors here had costs. Pressure dressing over the area of vascular concern. She assessed his color. Better. Not good, but better. "Maintain pressure on this," she said. "Don't move the arm. I will come back." "Understood," he said. She stood. Ashby was in the doorway. He had Renner's M24 in his hands. He'd retrieved it before coming to find her, which was either premeditation or the specific efficiency of a man who processed situations quickly and acted on what they required. He held the rifle out. She took it. The Eastern Equipment Building was 40 meters away. The roof peaked at 11 feet. The individual Ashby had identified was at the northwest corner, which gave him a clear line into the main courtyard, where the inspection walkthrough was scheduled to pass and where Decker was presently standing in conversation with 2 NCIS agents who had arrived at 700 and had been waiting for exactly this moment to approach Strick. Sloan assessed the geometry. From ground level, the northwest corner was partially obscured by the roof overhang, roughly 15 degrees of obstruction. She needed elevation or a different angle entirely. She chose the angle. The vehicle bay on the south side of the equipment building had a loading dock that raised the ground level by 4 feet. She moved to it along the wall, staying below any sightline from the roof, and went up the dock ramp in a controlled movement that put her at the correct elevation to see past the overhang. Hale was in a prone position, bipod down, his full attention on the courtyard below. He had not heard her. The ambient noise of the base candidates in the water equipment running in adjacent buildings, the general sound signature of a military installation at morning operations, was providing enough cover that her movement had not registered. She had a clear shot, 890 meters. She looked at the position, the angle, the wind flags on the main building, steady 12 to 14 knots from the northwest, consistent. Better conditions than the night operation in the corridor. She went prone on the loading dock. The right shoulder settled into the position and pulled once the familiar objection of old damage and she redistributed her weight along the left side the way she had the night before. The pull subsided. She breathed. The scope found Hale in the northwest corner. She looked at his posture, the specific stillness of a shooter who had passed through the setup phase and was in the terminal sequence. She did not have time for the full protocol. She had what she had, and what she had was sufficient. She took 3/4 of a breath, held it, let 2 heartbeats pass, found the wind correction in the reticle with the arithmetic that her father had drilled into her until it was reflex rather than calculation. She squeezed the trigger. The round struck Hale's weapon at the receiver. The rifle left the roof, and Hale's body followed it, rolling back from the position and coming down on the second tier of the dock on the building's west side. A broken arm, a concussion. He was alive. The shot had been intended to disable, not kill. She had known where to place it to accomplish that specific outcome, because her father had taught her that precision meant you chose the result you wanted and then executed it, and that the ability to make that choice was the difference between a trained person and an armed one. She held the scope position for 2 seconds, confirmed the outcome. Then she stood, set the M24 down, and went back inside to Renner. He was where she had left him, upright against the wall, maintaining pressure, with his right hand exactly as instructed. His color had improved. He looked at her when she came through the door with the expression of a man who had been counting seconds and had reached a conclusion. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. She knelt beside him and checked the dressing, checked his pulse against the baseline she'd established before she'd left. Stable. The vascular involvement was resolving. "I need to get you to imaging," she said. "The reduction was successful, but I want confirmation on vascular status." "In a minute," he said. He was looking at her with something that had moved well past the expression she hadn't had a category for 2 days ago. "You came back." "I said I would. You had a rifle in your hand." "I had 2 problems," she said. "You were the first one." Renner was quiet for a moment. "Heal when you can," he said almost to himself. "Fight when you must." "Yes," she said. She helped him to his feet. In the courtyard, things had moved with the specific efficiency of a plan executed by people who had been ready. Strick had been in the second building of the inspection walkthrough when the 2 NCIS agents approached him. Decker had been present. Rourke had been present. The JAG officer from Strick's own staff had, in a moment that said something either about professional integrity or the practical calculation of someone who recognized which side of a shifting situation they wanted to occupy, stepped back and said nothing. Strick had not made a scene. He had looked at Decker for a long moment with the expression of a man who had known, in some interior place he had not examined closely for years, that a day shaped like this one was possible. He said, "Warren." Decker said, "I know." And that had been most of it, because the documentation was what it was, and Brees had been detained at his offices in Arlington at 08:30 that morning by federal agents executing a warrant prepared over the preceding 48 hours, and the structure Strick had relied on to make problems disappear had already been disassembled before he'd landed at North Island. Sloan brought Renner through the courtyard on their way to the medical facility, and she saw Strick standing between the 2 NCIS agents waiting, and she stopped. He was 61 years old. He had the bearing of a career officer, the posture, the presentation, the particular way of occupying space that decades of rank produced. He looked ordinary. That was the thing she had not fully prepared for and recognized she should have anticipated, because her father had told her that the people who made the catastrophic choices were almost always ordinary looking. The magnitude of a decision and the appearance of the person making it bore no relationship to each other. Strick looked at her. She had thought about this moment across 4 years, had composed and discarded a dozen versions of it, had imagined in her less disciplined moments that it would feel like the ending of a significant piece of music, a resolution that matched the weight of what had preceded it. It didn't feel like that. It felt like standing in a courtyard on a Saturday morning, looking at a man who had signed a document that killed her father, and understanding that the document was now in the hands of people who would do what needed to be done with it, and feeling underneath all of that the specific absence of relief she had assumed would come. She had been wrong about relief. She had expected it. It wasn't there. What was there was something quieter and less satisfying and more honest. The particular completion of a thing done correctly for the right reasons, which carried its own weight regardless of how it felt. Strick looked away first. She walked Renner to the medical facility without looking back. Decker found her there an hour later. Renner was in imaging stable, the vascular assessment confirming resolution, the shoulder documented and scheduled for orthopedic follow-up. Sloan was writing the incident report at the desk when Decker came in and sat against the wall in the way of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had been given permission to set it down. She kept writing. Hale is alive, Decker said. Broken arm and a concussion. The round hit his weapon. He paused. The shot was placed to disable. I know what the shot was placed to do, Graham, she said. I know you do. He was quiet for a moment. Breeze was taken this morning. The documentation your father assembled is now in the hands of 3 separate offices in CIS, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and the Department of Justice. Any one of those is sufficient. All 3 is permanent. I know, she said. She set the pen down, looked at what she'd written, signed it. Decker was watching her. How do you feel, he said. She had been asked this question before after difficult things, and had generally found it less useful than the people asking it seemed to believe. But Decker was asking it in the specific way of someone who wanted information rather than comfort, and she considered it honestly before answering. Like after a long surgery, she said, when the patient makes it, but you know there's damage that isn't going to fully resolve. Like you did the right thing and the only thing available, and it still costs something. Every time. Decker nodded slowly. He understood this in the way of a man who had spent a career in rooms where the right thing and the easy thing had never been the same thing, and who had long since stopped expecting them to coincide. Your father said something to me once, he said, before the Kunar mission. He was checking my kit and I asked him what he was most concerned about in the operation. He said he was only ever concerned about one thing. A pause. He said the only thing that genuinely worried him was whether the people around him could tell the difference between what was hard and what was wrong. He said most people confuse them. Sloan looked at her hands. He said that to me too, she said, about 10 different ways over 20 years. He was working on it like a draft he hadn't finished. Decker almost smiled. He had a lot of drafts. He did. The treatment room was quiet. Through the window, the base continued in its operational rhythms, indifferent to the morning's events. In the way institutions were indifferent, the mission continuing, because it always continued, the candidates still moving through their evolutions, the Pacific beyond the fence doing what it always did. Rourke appeared in the doorway. He looked at Sloan, at Decker, back at Sloan. Renner is asking for you, he said. He's being characteristically specific about it. She stood. Rourke didn't step aside immediately. He stood in the frame for a moment with the deliberateness of a man choosing words carefully before committing to them. You're staying with this team, Hayes, he said. Not a question, not a request, an operational decision already made. She met his eyes. Yes, Senior Chief. He stepped aside. She went through. Finch was in the corridor outside the imaging room. He was leaning against the wall with his arms folded, and when she came down the corridor, he straightened in a way that looked like it cost him something. Not physically, but in the specific manner. A proud man paid for a correction he knew he should have made earlier and hadn't. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the trident pin. He held it out, then stopped his hand extended and spoke first. I was wrong, he said, from the first morning, Simone. I had you in a category before you'd done anything, and I kept the category after you'd given me reasons to change it. Multiple reasons. He met her eyes without looking away from them. That's not how I operate. It's not how I'm supposed to operate. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment. The corridor was quiet. You changed the category when the evidence required it, she said. That's all anyone can do. Should have been faster. Yes, she said, but you got there. She took the pin, not an official designation, both of them understood that, but the acknowledgement of a man who had been wrong about something important and had decided that saying so directly mattered more than the discomfort of doing it. Your father, Finch said, from what I've heard today, he would have been someone worth knowing. He would have corrected you if you called him anything other than what he was, she said. He was a medic. He was proud of exactly that. Finch considered this. Fair enough, Doc. He walked away down the corridor, and something in the set of his shoulders was different from the way they'd been on the first morning, not softer, not less certain, but carrying the specific quality of a man who had finished a piece of unfinished business and could now move forward without it. Ashby was at the end of the corridor. He looked at the pin in her hand and looked at her face and said nothing because nothing was what the moment required, and he was a man who understood the weight of silence precisely. She called her mother that night. It was 2100 on the West Coast midnight in Fayetteville, and the phone rang 3 times before her mother picked up. She had been awake. Sloan knew the rhythm of how her mother answered at different hours. And this was the answer of someone who had been in her own company for a while, sitting somewhere quiet, not quite reading whatever was open in her lap. "It's me," Sloane said. "I know your number, baby." Her mother's voice had the register of midnight, softer, more open than daytime. "You okay?" "Yes." She was sitting on the steps outside the medical bay in the November air coming off the water, cold and clean. Above her, the sky had cleared fully, the stars at the density they reached on clear coastal nights. "I wanted to tell you something happened today. Something that needed to happen." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell me." Sloane gave her the shape of it. Not the operational details, those belonged to a chain of events beyond this conversation, but the essential structure. That the thing her father had started had been completed. That the people who needed to be held accountable for his death were going to be held accountable. That it had taken 4 years and it was done. When she finished, her mother was quiet for longer than the pauses before. "He knew," she said finally. "He told me in January before he deployed that last time. He said he'd sent something to someone he trusted completely. He said that when the time came, you'd know what to do with it." She paused. "He said that was the thing about you that was entirely your own. The knowing." Sloane looked at the stars. The heaviness that had been in her chest all day, the thing she had categorized as the cost of necessary things, shifted. Not gone. Rearranged into something she didn't have a precise word for. Something between resolution and grief, which were, she was realizing, not as different as she had always assumed. "He wasn't wrong about much," she said. Her mother made a sound that was half a laugh and something older than laughter. "No, he wasn't." Another pause. "You coming home for Christmas?" "I'll try." "That's not yes." "I'll try harder than last year." "That's closer to yes." Her mother's voice settled into something warmer. "Come home, Sloane. Come home and eat something and let me look at you for more than 2 days." "I will, I promise." She sat on the steps for a while after the call ended, in the cold air with the stars overhead and the distant sound of the water past the perimeter fence. And she thought about a man in a kitchen in Fayetteville on a Sunday morning with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. She thought about the way he had explained things, not by telling her what to think, but by showing her what to look at, and trusting that if she looked long enough and honestly enough, she would arrive at the right place on her own. He had been right about that. He had been right about most things. She went inside and did not dream. 5 months later, Sloane Hayes stood in front of 18 people in a classroom at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and wrote 4 words on the board behind her. The classroom was new, recently designated, recently equipped, the result of an approval process that had moved through USSOC with speed that bureaucratic processes rarely achieved. The momentum had been generated by a brief Decker had submitted to the Senate Armed Services Committee in December, which had produced the kind of institutional response that occurred when the people reviewing documentation could not locate a reasonable argument against what it recommended. The program was called Integrated Combat Medicine. It was the first of its kind in the formal curriculum of United States Army Special Operations Command. There had been discussions about something like it for years, the way there were always discussions about things that made obvious sense, and that no one had yet assembled the specific combination of evidence, advocacy, and timing to push across the line. The evidence was her father's 4 years of operational documentation. The advocacy was Decker's. The timing was Saturday at Coronado. The 18 people in the chairs in front of her were medics and corpsmen and one special forces officer who had cross-trained in medicine and wanted to understand the tactical integration side of a skill set he'd built from the other direction. Their ages ranged from 22 to 36. Some had combat experience. Some had training experience. Some had neither yet and knew it and were here specifically because of that. All of them had been told the same thing in their assignment orders. The instructor had operated on 3 continents, in circumstances not described in detail, had documented outcomes that the program office had reviewed and not publicly characterized, and was not someone to be late for. Sloane looked at them. She thought about the first thing her father had taught her. Not the shooting that had come later, not the medicine that had come second. The first thing was simpler and more important than either of them, and he had taught it not in a classroom, but in the field behind their property in Fayetteville when she was 10 years old. He had found a deer at the edge of the tree line, hit by a car on the road the night before, that had made it to the grass and gone down there. He had knelt beside it and shown her without sentiment and without false comfort what the difference looked like between an injury that was going to resolve and one that wasn't, and what you did in each case, and why knowing the difference before you acted was the whole of the work. She had asked him afterward what you did when you knew it was the second kind and couldn't change it. He had said, you stay. You don't look away. You make sure that everything you could do, you did. and then you carry it forward. She had been 10 years old and she had understood him completely, and she had carried that understanding into every room she had worked in since, and it had not failed her once. She turned and wrote on the board the 4 words he had written on the wall of the Forward Operating Base Clinic in Kunar Province in the fall of 2019, 3 months before he sent the envelope to Walter Reed 2 years before Hellman. The 4 words she had seen in his handwriting in a photograph he had sent her of the clinic, captioned with nothing because he had known she would understand what they meant without explanation. Drag them out alive. She set the marker down, turned to face the 18 people. That is the entire course, she said. Everything else is the explanation of that. She began. Renner came by the classroom on the 4th week. His shoulder was at 80% the orthopedic assessment's expected outcome, which Renner had characterized to her face as unacceptable, and which he was working toward improving through a rehabilitation protocol she had written specifically for the mechanics of his injury, and which he was following with the completeness of someone who had decided to do a thing fully or not at all. He stood in the doorway during the break and looked at the board and looked at her. "How are they doing?" he said. "The ones who think they already know are catching up to the ones who know they don't. By week 6, they'll be close." He nodded, looked at the 4 words on the board again. "You were always going to do this." She thought about that for a moment. "My father was going to do this," she said. "I'm finishing it." Renner considered this. He'd have been good at it. "He was the best teacher I ever had," she said, "and I've had some good ones since." He left before the class came back from break, which was his way arrivals and departures without ceremony, which she had come to understand was how he expressed a particular form of respect. The ceremony was for things that required it. Some things communicated more clearly without. The email from Decker came on a Thursday evening in April, 6 months to the week from Saturday at Coronado. She was in her quarters finishing the lesson plan for the second cohort's 7th week. The program had been approved for expansion 3 weeks after the first cohort completed the kind of institutional momentum that once established became its own argument for continuation. She had not been surprised by the approval. Her father had told her once that good ideas didn't need advocates as much as they needed proof of concept. The first cohort had been the proof. The email was brief. Decker wrote briefly by nature, compressed, functional, the language of a man who had spent decades communicating under conditions where additional words carried additional costs. Briefing at 0800 Monday. New team. Operating area adjacent to previous. The question is only whether you're ready. You're the only one who knows the answer to that. She read it twice. She thought about a holding room with fluorescent light and a phone ringing in a cardiac ward at Walter Reed. She thought about a hillside in Kunar Province in the dark, and 2 rounds that needed to be placed, and a choice about which problem to address first. She thought about Renner on the floor, and the specific weight of an M24 accepted from Ashby's hands without a word spoken between them. She thought about a man in a kitchen in Fayetteville with coffee going cold and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead in a way of explaining things that assumed you were capable of understanding them. She thought about 18 people in chairs and 4 words on a board and the work of the next cohort and the one after that, and how chains were built one link at a time by people who understood that the chain was the point. Paul Merritt Hayes had built a chain with his daughter as the next link without explaining to her that was what he was doing, because she would not have needed to be told. He had known that. He had known her the way people knew each other when they had spent enough years paying attention. She opened a reply, typed 2 words, hit send. Outside the window at Fort Bragg, April was finishing what it had started the tree line, but along the perimeter fully green. Now the air warm enough to have committed to something, the light coming in at the long angle of late afternoon that made the grass between the buildings look like it was lit from inside rather than above. She had not arrived at whatever her father had been building toward. She understood now that you didn't arrive at it. The work extended as far as you could carry it, and then you handed it to the people in the chairs, and they carried it further, and the distance covered by all of them together was what mattered. The chain, not the link. She closed the laptop. She thought about Monday. About a team she hadn't met in an operating area she would study until she knew its terrain, the way she knew the corridor behind their property in Fayetteville, the way she had known the hills around Kunar before she ever set foot in them. She thought about her father's voice on a Sunday morning, unhurried, explaining things to a 10-year-old who was paying complete attention. She thought, I know what to do. Monday was 3 days away. She was ready.